Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture, where we will be discussing the next chapter on Mexican Americans. And this chapter talks about the Mexican American population that begins to arrive between 1900 and 1930. And the reading talks about factors contributing to the Mexican immigration act during this time period. So first of all, they're pulled to the US by stories of work and opportunities from other folks that were here before them. At the same time, they're pushed from Mexico by losing lands and poverty conditions they were experiencing. There was also violence that they were escaping that began with the Mexican Revolution in 1910. There was also the creation of railroads from central Mexico to the United States, which facilitated their movement, their ability to be able to, more easily travel from certain parts of Mexico to the United States. So that between 1900 and 1930, the population grew from 375,000 to 1,160,000. The reading also talks about the experiences of Mexicans as laborers in the United States. Most were concentrated in unskilled labor. They worked in construction, railroad, and steel work, while women worked in garment industries, canneries, and other food processing plants. Most, however, worked as agricultural labor, replacing Asian workers that had been excluded by earlier laws, as we've discussed in previous chapters. And the reading also gave us examples of why they were considered better for agricultural work due to their supposed crouching and bending habits. So there was a lot of sort of beliefs around their inherent capabilities or suitability for agricultural work. These are some examples of ideas about the Mexican labor that existed during that time. The white people won't do the work and they won't live as the Mexicans do on beans and tortillas and in one-room shacks. Whites cannot be as easily domineered, led, or directed as the Mexicans. And someone else stated, I prefer Mexican labor to other classes of labor. It is more humble and you get more for your money. So you see this sort of general attitude at the time as well by white folks, by white farm owners about in contrast to having other workers or white workers. At the same time, there was labor resistance during this time period. In 1933, there was the San Joaquin Valley strike, where 12,000 laborers went on strike, demanding higher wages. Employers tried to break the strike by evicting laborers and their families from camps. And here in this image, you get a sense of what their living arrangements were like. They dumped their belongings in the highway, arrested labor leaders, and at the same time, women were active participants in these strikes. Finally, there was a compromise win on wages where they gained an increase, but not to the amount they originally demanded. The reading also talked about Punjabi Mexican marriages during this time as a result of, on the one hand, the immigration exclusions that South Asian immigrants were experiencing, which limited the immigration of women that or wives that they might have had back home that they could bring with them, resulting in marriages between Punjabi men and Mexican women. So these folks met in the agricultural fields. Both were populations that were working in agriculture. As I stated, immigration restrictions didn't allow Punjabis to bring wives from India. And these laws also restricted Punjabis from owning lands. So Punjabi Mexican marriages allow Punjabis to have families, children, and to own land through their Mexican wives. So they would purchase land and put it in the name of their wives as a way to be able to own land as a family. The reading also talked about the various forms of discrimination against Mexicans during this time period. They experienced segregation, not being allowed to sit with whites in restaurants and movie theaters. Mexican children attended segregated schools. Mexicans were perceived as invading the Southwest. Also as, quote, a miscegenationist threat to white racial purity. So we've seen this kind of language being used against a number of different groups, sort of this fear that they would marry interracially with whites and therefore were considered a threat to white racial purity. And this all led to calls for limits to Mexican immigration, which began during this time period. And this is a quote from what white rancher's wife: "Let him," meaning the Mexican, "have as good an education, but still let him know he's not as good as a white man. God did not intend him to be. He would have made them white if he had." So this really captures sort of this sense and attitude towards Mexicans as being inferior to the white population. One of the things that happens during this time period as a result of the Great Depression is that Mexican Americans become the scapegoats of the Depression, particularly throughout the Southwest. And in this image, what you see is a crowded train station as people are waiting to get onto trains that were taking people back to Mexico. So what we begin to see during this time period is a pattern of hating Mexicans when our economy is bad, like during the Great Depression, and loving them when we need their labor, like during different war periods. As the economic situation becomes desperate, there's a rise in repatriation movements, some voluntary and some forced. Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1929, which makes the unlawful entry into the US a felony and authorizes the US to carry out a federal deportation campaign. Members of the community organized fundraisers to help families move back to Mexico, including among them artist Diego Rivera, who used the proceeds from one of his murals to organize the repatriation of Mexicans to farm cooperatives in Mexico. In other cases, local officials and groups of individuals took it upon themselves to gather and force out Mexican families, raiding farms with Mexican workers and invading homes. Mexicans were put on trains that were escorted to the border. At times, those targeted for forced expulsion were labor organizers, so there was a politics to this as well. An estimated between 500,000 and 1 million people were sent to Mexico through this repatriation movement. And this included a significant number of American-born citizens. And so there is a lot of literature and stories about these folks being repatriated, but also the children who were American citizens who were sent to Mexico, a place that they'd never been to, didn't necessarily know Spanish, and the impact that this repatriation experience had on them, who were, again, American citizens. So this ends our lecture for this week. I will see you guys next time.